Between 1929 and 1934, the Soviet state launched an aggressive campaign to collectivize agriculture and forcibly settle nomadic peoples across Kazakhstan. For millions of Kazakhs, this was not progress, it was catastrophe. Our team asked three research questions. Was Soviet sedentarization a genuine project of social modernization? What were the consequences for the Kazakh people and their strategies of survival? And how does this history continue to shape Kazakhstan today? To answer these questions, we work with primary sources, scholarly literature, and materials from the Presidential Center of the Republic of Kazakhstan.
To understand Soviet collectivization, we must first look at its deep roots. Throughout the 19th century, Russian imperial land policy systematically disposed Kazakh nomads of their traditional pasture land, the very foundation of the nomadic economy. By the time of the 1970 revolution, the Kazakh intelligentsia, organized throughout the Alash movement and the pages of the Kazakh newspaper, had already begun debating whether agriculture and sedentarization could coexist with nomadic culture, or whether they would destroy it. As historian Len Campbell argues, these early debates between reformists and conservative currents within the intelligentsia framed the political tensions that would erupt under Soviet rule, when the choice was no longer a debate but a decree.
Soviet sedentarization was not a voluntary modernization program, but an ideologically coercive policy that dismantled the ecological logic and productive structure of the Kazakh nomadic economy. In 1925, Philip Goloshokin, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, launched his so-called Malый Oktябрь, the Small October campaign. He declared that the Kazakh steppe had not yet experienced a real revolution, and that Soviet power must be brought to the Alu through radical social restructuring. Nomadism was reframed not as a rational ecological adaptation, but as a class problem, a symbol of backwardness. In his address to the 5th Congress of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, Goloshokin explicitly called for the dismantling of the traditional Alu economy as precondition of Soviet construction. Sarah Cameron, in The Hungry Steppe, demonstrates that Soviet planners deliberately ignored the ecological rationality of nomadic pastoralism, the way mobile herding had allowed Kazakhs to manage scarce water and grass across vast distance. Sedentarization destroyed this balance. This reveals a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Soviet policy. A program presented as modernization was built on the erasure of an existing, functioning system of survival, one that had sustained millions of people for centuries. Collectivization in Kazakhstan triggered one of the most catastrophic demographic disasters of the Soviet era, causing the death of approximately 1.5 million Kazakhs and a mass exodus that permanently transformed the ethnic and social landscape of the steppe. Between 1930 and 1933, forced collectivization decimated livestock herds that formed the material base of the Kazakh economy. Soviet requisitioning brigades confiscated cattle, horses, and sheep, not only as economic assets, but as food sources, means of transport, and cultural markers. When the herds were gone of a meaningful load, hundreds of thousands fled across the borders to China, Mongolia, and Afghanistan. This catastrophe, known in Kazakh as Asharshlok, the Great Hunger, was not a natural disaster, it was a policy outcome. Robert Kindler, in Stalin's Nomads, Power and Famine in Kazakhstan, documents that the Kazakh population fell by approximately 38% between the censuses of 1926 and 1939, among the highest proportional death tolls of any Soviet collectivization campaign. A rare primary source from inside the Soviet apparatus, a letter written by Nurassyl to Stalin in 1932, described mass starvation, the collapse of livestock production, and the flight of entire communities across Kazakh regions. Nicola Pianchova confirms that Soviet grain procurement quotas in Kazakhstan were maintained even as the famine intensified, a decision that made mass death structurally inevitable. At the Presidential Center, the exhibition on Kazakhstan clear heritage reminds us that the Kazakh land bore state violence repeatedly. First the famine of collectivization, then atomic tests at Semipalatinsk. These were not accidents, they were products of the system that treated Kazakhstan as a space to be controlled, not a people to be protected. The memory of collectivization and sedentarization became a foundation of Kazakh national identity after 1991 and continues to shape the country's political culture, sovereignty narrative, and international positioning today. After independence, the Kazakh state undertook a deliberate process of historical reclamation. Ashashokh was officially recognized as a national tragedy. Nomadic heritage was restored to the center of cultural identity. The new state positioned itself not simply as a successor to the Soviet Republic, but as the expression of the people who had survived dispossession, famine, and colonialism, and who now claim their own future. As the presidential center, the symbols of independence, the coat of arms, the state flag, and the ceremonial seals visually encode the nomadic past as a foundation of modern statehood. The diplomatic gifts on display, Chinese jade objects, ornamental weapons from various nations, ceremonial chess sets, signal Kazakhstan's emergence as sovereign and internationally respected actor. Contemporary maps of Kazakh cities exhibited there also document how Soviet-era forced settlement patterns created new urban centers, a visible legacy of centralization that persists in the built environment. As Pyeonchou argues, the destruction of nomadism was inseparable from a project of making Kazakhstan liable to and permanently dependent on the Soviet state, a dependency that independence in 1991 sought to undo. The photographs of President Tokayev with world leaders displayed alongside the symbols are not coincidental. They represent a conscious foreign policy statement by a nation asserting sovereignty it was once denied. Kazakhstan today does not simply remember the famine, it built its international identity through that memory. Our analysis leads us to a clear position. Soviet sedentarization and collectivization in Kazakhstan were not a genuine project of social modernization. They were coercive policies that dismantled the nomadic economic caused mass death and imposed a new social order by state force. The evidence from primary sources, from historians Cameron, Kindler, and Pyeonchou, and from museum materials at the presidential center all point in the same direction. What was called progress was experienced as destruction. Kazakhstan's journey from the Ashashokh to independence and to international sovereignty is a testament to the resilience of the people who survived policies designed to remake and nearly erase them. Understanding this history is not only essential to the Kazakh national memory, it is indispensable to any honest account of Soviet modernity.
Как самого человека представлено.